Doesn't look like there's anyone in yet. But they'll be here any minute. So, yep, looks like we have a couple of people in. Hello, welcome. Just opened up the webinar a minute early just to let people in. If you could please let us know where you're coming from or where you're watching us from. Also, what brought you here today? What cuisines are you interested in knowing more about? What cuisines have you do you come from? Like what cuisines have you cooked? As did your family cook? Looks like we have a few more people. Just wait a little bit longer. Yeah, please chat away in the chat. Let us know where you're coming from, why you came here today, why you're watching. And I'll just go ahead and get started with my introduction, and hopefully more people will be coming in. Hi, if this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I thank you very much for joining us for this virtual program for National Dish Around the World in Search of Food, History, and the Meaning of Home. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are very happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. I'll put a link in the chat so you can take a look at that. And now I'll move on to introducing our guests. Our author, Anya von Bremzen, is the winner of 3 James Beard Awards, a contributing writer at Afar magazine, and the author of 6 acclaimed cookbooks. Her memoir, Mastering the Art of Soviet Cooking, has been translated into 19 languages. Anya has been contributing editor at Travel and Leisure and Food and Wine and has written for Savoir, The New Yorker, and Foreign Policy, among other publications. Her work has been anthologized in several editions of Best Food Writing and in the Best American Travel Writing. Our moderator, Andrew Beers, is the author of 2 novels, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, Gastronomica, Virginia Quarterly Review, The Writer's Chronicle, Ocean Magazine, Food History News, and Living Bird. He received his MA in Anthropology Archaeology from the University of Virginia and his MFA in Fiction from Spalding University. Now, like I said before, you can chat, have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, though, please just put that in the Q&A section so it doesn't get lost in the chat. Please also note that you can click on captions. Actually, I'll have to turn that on now so that everyone can see them. Yeah, so you can click on captions to see live auto captioning for this event. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase National Dish through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guest. So that is all from me. Please, engage in conversation in the chat, put your questions in the Q&A, and enjoy the conversation with Anya and Andrew. And I'll turn this over to them now.
Hi, Anya. How are
Hello,
you?
how are
Good to see
you?
you.
Good to see you.
Good. I've been really looking forward to this. I'm excited about this.
Same here.
So first of all, first things first, I loved your book.
Thank you.
Learned a lot. Anybody who's on this webinar, kind of wondering, should I read the book? The answer is yes. It's fantastic.
Please.
It's a great worldwide journey. Really exciting. So just wanted to go to start out. What inspired you to write National Dish?
Well, National Dish, just to introduce for people who don't know it, it goes into myths and stories and origins of some of the world's most beloved and iconic dishes. And it looks at it from the perspective of national identity. There's like so many ways to look at pizza or ramen, but I'm specifically examining how these became part of the country's kind of soft power and national brand. And what inspired me, it was several things. My first cookbook that I wrote, published in 1990, was called Please to the Table. And I was born in the Soviet Union. And the book was about the cuisines of what was then an empire. And it was about the diversity, they would have foods from Georgia, Armenia, Uzbekistan, and all were part of the Soviet Union. But as the book went to print, the Soviet Union went bust. And suddenly, this former, domains of the empire became independent nations. And in the subsequent 20 years, I returned to this post-Soviet spaces, and I kind of saw nation building of which national cuisines were an important part as it was happening. And it was kind of like just this fascinating thing, because we forget that nation is a very young concept, in fact. Before the French Revolution kind of articulated the whole idea of the nation state, we had empires, we have different duchies, absolute kingdoms. So the nation really is kind of the product of the late Enlightenment. And even in the 20th century, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all these countries that we think as countries, Lebanon, Syria, then later, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Ukraine, they were parts of different political entities. So as I kept thinking about this phenomenon of nation and its cuisine, globalization became so intense that you think, oh, well, the whole idea of the nation, should be dissolving. But in fact, the opposite was happening. You had all these populist dictators, kind of drumming the idea of the nation. You had people sort of investing more and more emotional power into the idea of place and origins and linking a place with cuisine. So it kind of seemed like almost a natural idea, given my own career, how much I travel, to look at these iconic dishes of 6 countries and see how they figure into the whole nation building process and national identity.
Fantastic. I'd love to dial in on something that you said during that, which is that France kind of articulated the idea of the nation state, I believe is the way you put it. And that's where you begin your book. That's what you begin with an exploration of pot-au-feu. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and how and why you chose to begin the book with time in Paris and France.
Well, as we were talking, the French Revolution, which articulated the constitution in the name of equal citizens under the idealist banner, fraternité, égalité, liberté, really influenced how other revolutions were happening later in the 19th century and the national self-determination. But what's important in terms of food, that France was really the first country, the first nation to articulate the relationship between food and nation in such a powerful way. It's really where the rest of Paris was where the restaurant was invented. It exported words like gastronomy, chef, sauces, all the techniques that I still use today in contemporary cooking. Before the revolution, in mid 1600s, there was a first cookbook with a national title, Le Cuisinière Françoise, that was written by a chef called Lavarenne. And the whole discourse, the whole conversation about food as a national treasure, as a uniquely French asset that they were exporting throughout the world since the 19th century, it really belongs to France. So I go to Paris and I look at this classic national dish, pot-au-feu, which is a kind of stew in a soup, vegetables, meat, broth, everything in one dish, representing that ideal of liberty, equality, fraternity, like a communal soup pot, as you will. But I land in Paris, and it's a completely globalized city.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to research pot-au-feu. It's actually a very funny chapter. I'm trying to research this dish, and everyone's like, "Oh, have you been to this latest mezcal bar? Oh, have you had the chocolate babka? That's the big rage. Oh, bao buns." And this kind of sets me off wondering where how does a national dish fare in the age of globalization?
And I mean, so we're talking about these national origins and obviously like globalization and how much is going in France right now in terms of food culture. How did your book is really a global journey, right? I mean, you Turkey, France, Spain, Mexico, Japan. How did you choose what dishes to follow after your initial explorations in France?
Well, some dishes were obvious because they're so globalized and so part of our lives. Pizza, right? How can you not write about pizza? Ramen in Japan. Again, ramen is something that's made in prisons and college dorms, and it's like a multi-billion-dollar industry. Then I go to Spain and I look at tapas, which is another very influential concept. Less than one dish, but a way of eating. The small shared small plates that you eat as you shuffle from bar to bar. That became like this hugely important idea as the dominance of French cuisine was waning, and the whole idea of the 5-course menu, people wanted to eat in a certain way. So I trace it to the origins in Andalusia, in southern Spain. Then I go to Oaxaca and I look at tortillas, which is again something very, very global. But in Oaxaca, they have very special significance, maize tortillas as opposed to wheat. And I also look at mole. That is less a famous dish, but it's such an amazing representation of Mexico's national identity because it represents what they call mestizaje, the melting, the fusing of European and indigenous influences in Mexican cuisine. And then I ended Istanbul in Turkey, where I have an apartment. So it was kind of a homecoming and I look at meze, which is kind of the Middle Eastern answer to tapas. And through these meze, I trace the multicultural nature of the Ottoman Empire and what happened to that idea of multiculturalism, because empires are multicultural, right? What happened to it after this intense period of nationalization that Turkey went through after it became a republic in 1923.
Fantastic. So, I mean, all of the dishes, obviously, they're all national dishes. They exist in a globalized world. But as you mentioned, pizza probably stands out as perhaps the most globalized. I mean, perhaps maybe along with tortillas, rice, but pizza really stands out as something wherever you go in the world, wherever I've been anyway. There's pizza. And you do a wonderful exploration of the origins of pizza in Naples. Can you tell us a bit about what you refer to as the pizza effect?
Yeah, that's an interesting term, pizza effect. So the thing to remember about pizza, some dishes are disputed. Many dishes are disputed. Pizza is indelibly tied to Naples. So much so that at the end of the 19th century, if you told Northern Italian pizza, that just meant something squashed flat. They would think it's like maybe a sweet pie. The term was really not understood outside Naples until well into the 19th century. And pizza is a product of Neapolitan overcrowding and poverty. Something to consider, Naples in the 19th century, mid-19th century, had 10 times the urban density of Victorian London. Can you imagine? Yeah, I mean, people literally were
Yeah,
just
that's incredible.
squeezed into this tiny streets, semi-living on the street. And pizza was a salvation. One writer called it el pronto soccorso dello stomaco, the first aid of the stomach. It cost very little. It was fairly nutritious. But it was really the food of the Neapolitan poor, and it was scorned and really maligned outside Naples. Like Carlo Collodi, the creator of Pinocchio, he wrote this travel book about a kid who travels all over Italy. And he said, what is pizza? Let's talk about pizza. It's something resembling complicated filth. This is, yeah, I mean, pizza got really bad rap. And it only became popular and recognized and eventually kind of conquered the world with the diaspora, with the immigrants. Because remember, Italy didn't exist as Italy until 1860s, until the unification. The unification produced a lot of chaos and poverty and very high taxes, especially in the South. So you had one of the largest recorded out migrations in the history of humanity. Mm-hmm. All these Southern Italians going to the Americas, what they call Le Due Americhe, the North and South America, and they started opening pizzerias. And there's something that is the scorned dish of the Neapolitan poor becomes suddenly this, really popular thing, because it's like a genius thing, right? Who doesn't want, a flatbread with tomato and cheese, and you can take it out and you can eat it in the pizzeria. And so I'm finally answering your question about the pizza effect. So the pizza effect is a term that is coined by a Hindu anthropologist in respect to yoga, because yoga, like pizza, was like not a big deal in India. And then it took off outside India, in the States, and then was re-imported back to India, but there's something now that represented status and kind of re-evaluated back home. The same thing more or less happens with pizza. So as pizza becomes a celebrated product and everyone knows about it, Neapolitans become very proud of it. It's kind of re-imported, especially with World War II, into Italy. And just only by the 80s, really, it becomes an all Italian specialty.
How long did that process? How long did that process take? Like, how long after the diaspora did it start kind of getting a new importance or a new level of respect in its home region?
Well, in Naples, it was always eaten. In Naples, it was a thing. It was something that Neapolitans were proud of because it sustained them through poverty. But all over Italy, quite recently, actually, in the 80s, it became a very popular beach food. So people would go Saturday on the beach all over Italy, and they would go to a pizzeria and have a pizza. Then with the recession in the 90s, it went from a Saturday thing to what they call a pasto completo, a whole meal, because it cost, under $10, and you could have, So people started having it several times a week as a meal. And now, in an interesting twist, there are a lot more pizzeria in northern Italy than there are in Naples. So that you have another version of the pizza effect, right? It sort of went and became exported, and now the North is eating more pizza than the South.
And I love that line, complicated filth. There's so much scorn in that, but it also, when Neapolitans went abroad, I mean, from what I'm understanding from you, that's still the food that they brought, that's home, right? So it doesn't really matter what people look at your food as. If that food speaks to home for you, that seems like it can be enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and this the fact that it started as kind of an impoverished, or like maybe a laborer's food, food for struggling people. Would you see that's something that you saw multiple times through this book? Does the national dish tend to begin high or low, to put a very broad and general phrasing on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the dishes became low. For instance, ramen is another example, and I sort of compare it to pizza, because after we spent a month in Naples discovering all these myths and fascinating stories behind pizza that haven't really been told. We end in Tokyo, and I'm still thinking about the pizza effect, because ramen, well, first of all, ramen is a Chinese originated dish, even though Japan claims it as its part of its cool Japan brand and soft power. It's lo mein, it's Chinese noodles that were served and prepared in the treaty ports, such as Yokohama. And by the 1920s, they sort of migrated out of that ghetto, and the Japanese started appreciating them. But when it really came into its own was in the, between the two worlds, but especially after during the post-World War II reconstruction, when there was this massive labor force rebuilding Japan, and they subsisted on ramen, which is how Japan kind of crowned it as their national dish. And then you have this guy who's also Chinese, born in Taiwan, Momofuku Ando, who invents I think it was 1956, the instant ramen. And this is the invention the Japanese, when they take surveys, the Japanese are most proud of. This is they invented instant ramen, and then it goes into its own journey throughout the world and just becomes this other thing, right?
It's amazing. I found the Japanese chapter fascinating, partially because it exposed my own total ignorance of current Japanese food or cooking. I mean, I've traveled to Japan. We have family in Japan, but I was really struck when you're talking to Masaki Funakubo, who you describe as a rice geek,
Mhm.
and he says with a certain amount of despair, kind of, well, who eats rice these days? It's been kind of displaced by ramen and the noodles that you're describing.
Not just by ramen, but by foreign foods as well. So the
Mm,
other, I'm looking, in Naples, I look at pizza, but also at pasta. In Tokyo, I look at ramen, but also at gohan, which is cooked rice, which is a cornerstone of like the most ancient, supposedly ancient, but not that ancient actually, Japanese meal called washuko. So you have miso soup, cooked rice, and three cooked dishes to go with the rice. And that structure, that meal is supposedly very old and is imbued with almost mystical respect, for the representing, the Japanese self and the Japanese, spirit. But in fact, it's really losing out to all these important trends. The same as with Paris. In fact, the Guardian just ran an article how Japanese are completely turning away from rice, which is what I've been finding out from experts there as well. The rice consumption have been down since 1960s, as is consumption of sake and miso and all these traditional things that we associate with Japan and we think everyone loves. Yeah, they love it, but they want to eat, they have such an astounding choice. The best French food is in Tokyo. The best Italian food is in Tokyo.
mhm.
Korean, anything you want, you can find. You go to a department store food floor, and you just go wild because there's so many choices. And yeah, the Japanese are globalized, and also in Japan, there's this phenomenon they call indigenization, which
Mhm.
is kind of like appropriation. When something takes off, they kind of consider that as their own. So I did this very funny poll. I started asking people, well, what do you think is more Japanese? What do you prefer? Choux pastry, which is the word for choux, which is French, or wagashi, Japanese pastry. And the woman looks at me and is like, well, choux is Japanese. And then I said, well, do you prefer izakaya or McDonald's? They said, well, McDonald's is Japanese. It's insane. Yeah, because they call it Magdo or Sutabo, the Starbucks, and they have Japanese flavors of coffee, and a lot of the Japanese think that is Japanese.
It reminds me, I've read about Kentucky Fried Chicken as being sucked into a Japanese Christmas tradition now. Apparently, people like it's because Colonel Sanders, he's got the white beard and everything, and somebody marketed it in the early 80s, and apparently it's broadly believed that Kentucky Fried Chicken is like a traditional American Christmas dish now. People order their place their orders a long time in advance and all that kind of thing. But it's I think you use the term fake lore in
Yeah.
your book. It kind of reminds me of that, how these things get going, and we kind of shake our heads like, what, anyway. Um, so can you tell us about, like, when we're talking about rice falling off as kind of a core staple, that's the assumption is you'd be eating it at every meal. Are there other instances where you ran into that? I mean, this would one interesting thing to me is that I'm not sure I would, if I had traveled to Japan right now, I'm not sure I would notice the fall in rice. Like, right? That's something you have to do kind of a deep dive into to understand, like, actually what people are having on their daily tables. Um,
Well, this is where as a writer, you do what's called research, right?
mm,
You look at the statistics, and everyone. It's actually a well-known fact in Japan that the rice consumption is like way down. So there are figures for that, and rice farming has been very heavily subsidized
mm,
for decades and decades, and it's really important part of the political power. Because the farmers are, voting bloc for the ruling Conservative Party, and so yeah, and whenever you talk to a sake producer, they will tell you how the consumption is down and beer is up and imported whiskeys. So you kind of know it, and then but just talking to people on the street, you say, "What's your breakfast?" Because rice actually was eaten for rice, miso soup, and side dishes. It's a
mhm,
traditional
mhm.
Japanese breakfast, and this is what supposedly brings the family together. This is what makes the Japanese family Japanese. And you ask people, what do you have for breakfast? And they were like, oh, OJ and French toast, or croissant. Croissants are incredible in Japan and so huge. So you kind of just sense it. at the same time, yes, if you go as a foreigner and it's such an inscrutable place, and yes, you do see everyone eating rice and you think, oh, like, what's a big thing about it? But the stats are there.
Interesting. So to explore more kind of the connection between, nation and food, I think in the section on Spain, you connect food and cooking to a conscious nation building effort as much as you do in any other chapter. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you learned about how Spanish food helped to define the Spanish nation as it was coming into its modern form?
Well, actually, it's slightly the opposite. The Spanish nation, every country has its own trajectory and its own history of nation building. And you have this important symbolic elements such as, a national anthem, a national flag, right? And national soccer team. And Spain, in fact, had a rather weak nation building. It didn't even have social coherence until well into the 19th century. It had a very disastrous 19th century. They lost the colonies, which was called El Desastre. From being this, menacing, horrible empire, they went from being, just like a really second-rate nation. And food, more than like nation building, of which, for instance, a national cookbook is an important part, right? How do you define a canon, right? You create a national, someone creates a cookbook and it becomes national. So that link was actually weak in Spain. What you had was the whole tapas tradition, which is also fairly recent as we know it today, maybe early 20th century, late 19th century. And that kind of gives the nation a social coherence, the whole ritual of bonding as a nation, you can argue, or as a neighborhood, or as as different kinds of community, of bonding at these tapas bars, which are really crowded, or over these small dishes, which tend to be similar from bar to bar, but it's it's in southern Andalusian tradition. But this is a very important part of being Spanish, and every Spanish person recognizes. And this is something that almost came spontaneously, especially after the death of Franco, when Spain was like in the dumps. During his dictatorship, it became part of a symbol of new lifestyle and kind of moving on from this horrible past.
Interesting. So moving on to Oaxaca, you discover or encounter a wild variety of moles. I mean, there's the 7 classic moles, which I think somebody says to you, well, those are actually all just from the Central Valleys area. Like it's a pretty limited window that I certainly have into what the classic moles are. And she says there's going to be more than 200. So that's, with that many varieties, with that many approaches to mole, I'll just ask the question that you raise yourself in the book, which is, what exactly is a mole? What's the commonality between all of this?
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to tell. Mole is from Nahuatl, which is the language of Aztecs. Muli, which kind of simply meant sauce. And so anything containing chilies and anything is pounded, in pre-Hispanic times would be a mule. But then you have the colonial tradition. The colonists obviously brought so many foodstuffs, spices, which were status symbols, bread, which goes into a mole to thicken it. They started adding chocolate at some point. So the whole legend of the classic mole, which is the mole poblano, which has been elevated into a national dish, is in Puebla, which was the most European of Mexican cities, completely Spanish, built by Spaniards and for Spaniards. Liz Nunn wanted to impress a visiting viceroy, and she created, she had the Mesoamerican turkey, and then she creates this really complicated sauce of like some 40 ingredients, and by some divine inspiration, she puts chocolate in it, and then becomes kind of the story of the canonical mole poblano. Of course, like so many legends, no, Liz Nunn never existed. There's never a record. The same thing as with pizza margarita, that was supposedly named in honor of a queen that tasted it, never happened. So it's a myth. And it was elevated into this like national story in the 1920s after the revolution, after Mexico was searching for a new identity. And here was mole poblano, and it was a perfect representation of this mestizaje, this fusion of colonial Spanish and Amerindian pre-Hispanic elements. So that was considered the canonical mole until very recently. But now Mexico is looking differently at its identity. The whole mestizo identity, it involved a push to kind of acculturate and whiten the indigenous people, and that now is being recognized. So now the attention is more to like the indigenous moles. The mole verde, which has some Spanish elements like onions, garlic, cumin, but everything else is, the tomatillo, the chilies, and it's a much simpler mole. And it's almost nothing to do with mole poblano. It's like a completely different sauce. Then you have moles like ceguesa, which is eaten in Oaxaca and only certain parts of Oaxaca, that have no Spanish elements. It's just chilies, chilies and maize that is thickened with maize, and not the masa, not the dough, but actually maiz quebrado, which is like pounded in the metate. And these moles are becoming recognized and celebrated as, expressions of purely indigenous identity, as opposed to an identity that is mixed but is leaning white and leaning Spanish.
Do you have a favorite?
I love the mole negro, which is, a classic Oaxacan mole, and it involves a very dramatic step. And my chapter opens with that step where you shake out the chili seeds and tortillas and you burn it. You burn it on the, you kind of ignite it and the fire just leaps
that's a beautiful sight. Beautiful
to the
passage.
ceiling, and it's like this almost mystical thing. And that's what gives it this black color. But there's so many varieties, in every part of Oaxaca, which is a large state, has its own version of mole negro. So again, you cannot even talk about it as a common dish almost.
There was parts in that chapter, and it occurred to me, or it struck me that there's ways in which mole is almost as much an event as it is a dish.
Well, because it's so complicated. And imagine now you have blenders. Before blenders took off, in I would say 30s, 40s, 50s, and in cities, you had to do it all in the metate, all in the grinding stone. And some communities, in indigenous communities, still don't have electricity. They don't have the licuadora. They don't have the blender. So you wouldn't make it for two people, right? You would make it, it's fiesta food par excellence. You have, and I've watched it, and it's kind of amazing. You have these brigades of women who are just grinding everything, boiling this huge cauldron of the sauce, killing the turkeys. You kill the turkey, you buy it, live from the mercado. So it's a whole event. And there are certain ritual moles for different things. Like there's a mole called chichila, which is very austere. It has no sweetness, no sugar. And it's a mole for wakes and for deaths. And you usually prepare it when the coffin is in the house. So this mole is much more than a dish. It is a way of life, and it's a community ritual.
It's amazing. So it's an event, it's a ritual, often it's a celebration. It's obviously incredibly labor intensive. And on that, I'd like to ask you about kind of another kind of labor from the same cuisine, which is the making of tortillas, which I think that labor has a different meaning than that sort of celebratory labor around mole.
Well, no, tortillas, you serve the mole, you serve the tortillas with the mole, right?
Sure, of course.
Tortilla is part of absolutely everything. And it's like these other dishes, we think, it's always been part of, celebrated as, the essence of Mexicanness. But no, in fact, there was a drive, since the colonists arrived, there was a drive to replace tortillas with bread. And by the middle of the 20th century, Mexicans were eating more bread than tortillas. So it only became celebrated as a national symbol with NAFTA, when there was this fear of transgenic contamination of Mexican maize. And then this really grassroots movement sprang up to defend the tortilla, to defend Mexicanness, to defend indigenous Mexico against, this like imperialist drive. So tortilla is an amazing thing, right? The handmade tortilla. We think of it as just an absolute treasure. It's made with heirloom corn, heirloom maize. It's made by women by hand. What could be
Well,
more
that's what I wanted.
more
That's what I want
cherished,
to
more
talk about.
valued?
Is like the
But I look at it, the labor involved
uh-huh.
is astounding, because it's just backbreaking. And you're at the comal, usually wood fired, inhaling wood smoke. You're kneeling all the time, so there's all this related injuries, all this kind of context of domestic enslavement. So I started, I kind of paused at one point and I said, well, is it esclavitud, slavery, or empoderamento, or, empowerment? So I started asking Oaxacan women what they think. And so many of them, including, women who wrote a book, academic on domestic labor, say, yes, it is slavery. It is absolutely, because, you have a large family to make 200 tortillas, is many hours. And the women who sell them for nothing, for like 10 cents a piece, have to take the colectivo taxi to the market, which is another 3 hours a day. And basically their profit is something like 7 hours a day.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Is it something productive? So I talked to this very prominent indigenous politician, Zapotec woman, Efrasia Cruz Mendoza, and I said, what do we do about this? And she agrees that it's slavery. And she herself ran away when she was 12 because she heard that her father wanted to marry her off. She's from like a small community. She ran away to the city. She got an education. She said, well, no, we can't not make tortillas by hand, because maseca, the dried masa, we consider it contaminated. It's part of the women's everyday domestic power to make tortillas for the family. So her solution was to involve the guy. She said, like, why can't the dude help? He could, he could fetch the firewood, he could do something. So they're trying to kind of re-educate this and change this very patriarchal ways of indigenous communities to appreciate the woman's labor and to somehow involve the whole family. And also to give mills to women to make masa, because you take your corn to the mill at 4 a.m. if you want to start tortillas in the morning. And the guy, it's usually a guy who runs it, he's not there. So women are waiting. And she said, well, that's another form of abuse, right? So why don't we try to give families, their own mills, that the communities of women can use. So there's all these ways to respect indigenous culture and indigenous food ways without making it such a chore for the women.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, it's constant. And as you point out, I mean, there's even danger involved. I mean, there was a point at which indoor cook smoke was actually responsible for more harmful health outcomes than malaria on a global basis.
No, absolutely. I mean, imagine, every day you're making the tortillas, by a wood-fired comal, griddle. It's terrible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very intense.
And it also contributes to deforestation.
Oh, 100%.
So yeah, these are complicated equations. We can look at foods and national dishes simplistically and just say, oh, isn't this great? Like, let's celebrate it. But you can look, which is the whole idea of my book, National Dish, which is to look at the fascinating histories around identities, to look at complexities about labor, about gender, just to see what is really involved in these foods that we take for granted so often.
And as you were exploring, as you mentioned, this contributes to deforestation. I'll just mention as a way of transitioning to, like, you had to make choices about what to narrow down here. But in Ethiopia, I mean, Addis Ababa was almost abandoned in the 1890s because of the level of deforestation caused by cooking fires. Like, that's why eucalyptus was actually introduced, was as a fuel source that would allow the city to maintain in place.
Wow.
They were going to move the entire capital. I mean, it was only 30 years old or something at the time, but that was what they'd been doing, was shifting around, and that actually allowed it to be permanent, but with this cook smoke that's very dangerous and not great for the environment. But that's a way of transitioning to, it's a big world. You cover a lot of ground. What weren't you able to get to? Were there any foods that you would have included if you'd had infinite time and infinite space?
Well, the book is 6 chapters and 6 cuisines. I had 12 in mind, but then the pandemic happened. So
what were the other 6?
Well, I was definitely going to go to India and Britain simultaneously to look at curry. as something that represents colonialism, the way that the travel between two countries is fascinating. I was definitely going to Thailand because to look at pad thai, which is an extremely manufactured dish. It just came into being in the 1940s as literally as a top-down fiat, and it was another Chinese dish. I forget. I was going probably to Africa, Ethiopia, to look at injera. So yeah, I had big plans, but in the end, also just to kind of take a deeper dive into each place, because each city that I stay a month, it has interesting, fascinating characters. It becomes too much in a way to do too many chapters. So I'm glad the way it worked out, and maybe there's a sequel.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got space to do. You can do your next.
Also,
your next
I wanted to do an American dish, probably barbecue. Go to the South.
Yeah, I mean that's got to be that's the inevitable question, right? Like to tie it back to the Mark Twain House. I mean in the 1870s when Twain was traveling around Europe, I mean he put together this fantasy menu of I'm eating in hotels, it's terrible, da 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 da. So, but he didn't land on one dish. It was like 100 items long.
Oh wow!
And yeah, and it doesn't start where you would expect. I mean, the first thing he listed is like, oh man, I can't wait to get back home and eat radishes. I mean, I think you could probably it'd take a while for you to land on that, right? But it's radishes, baked apples, stewed oysters, fried oysters, maple syrup, frogs, all this stuff. So there wasn't like one thing that he could dial down on. And like reflecting on that, it's so interesting to me because like how long does it take to develop, or what's the dynamic for actually selecting out like what is the national dish, what is the national cuisine? But if you were going to do the American chapter, you've already said you would focus on barbecue. What other dishes do you think would be part of a typical American menu for you, or what angles would you like to explore?
I think when you look at America from abroad, like I travel a lot, and the first thing that people say, "Oh, you're from the States." Oh, hamburguesa, hamburger. I think definitely hamburger. It's like like ramen, like pizza. It's one of the world's most globalized dishes, and it's connected to so many things. Industrialization, world fairs. So I think the burger as a thing, but there's been a lot written on burgers, so I wouldn't be the first one. Yeah. I would say something southern, especially now that the conversation around race has become so deep and so interesting. I think fried chicken, definitely fried chicken.
Well, that was what on Twain's 100 item menu. Southern style is the most common modifier by far. I'd say about a quarter of them are specified.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this pastry is Southern style. All kinds of like pies, Southern style fried chicken, da, 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 but exactly that.
But also, you could look at taco as American, right? That's sure. That's what you get at your school lunches. The hard shell taco. You
mentioned pizza. It's like
how's lasagna and pizza. I mean, it's something that I didn't get a chance to get too much into the book. But I think school lunch, as well as an army ration, are like really important in shaping a national identity around food. Because imagine in school in New York where you have kids from every ethnic background. And now the menus are a little bit more diverse. But when I went to school in Philadelphia, that's how I became national. Kind of acculturated into American food, and we had lasagna, which I never had in Russia. This hard shell tacos, and I was like, "What is this? This is so weird." And this being Philadelphia, this sandwiches, piled with bologna salami, which I didn't know how to pronounce. I said to my mom, "Oh, they serve something called hoji." She said, "Like what hoji?" It's hoagie, right?
That's fantastic, and it's so interesting. You mentioned the school lunches and the GI meals and everything. It's kind of like a crossing of the streams. You probably know this. I don't know the name in Japan of the pasta dish, but I read about a very common school lunch meal is a kind of amalgam of foods that there were a ton of foods left over after the GIs left, essentially. And so it's various canned meats and all this kind of thing made into kind of like it's really a completely American pasta dish, but it became a standard Japanese school lunch.
Well, so in Korea, but it's not even that the GIs left the food. It's after the war, Americans were dumping their agri surpluses, including tons of wheat. into Asia to sort of avert the Red Scare, the commies, that was to kind of co-opt the Japanese into fighting fighting that cause on their side. So at one point, the Japanese school lunch was mostly entirely American products. That the Japanese didn't eat was wheat, even in the form of ramen, but it was American wheat, and it was meat, which the Japanese don't eat a lot of meat, like canned meat. So milk, which is again not a Japanese food. So yeah, you had a whole kind of generation of Japanese in probably Korean as well, kids that were acculturated in this American food culture.
Yeah,
talking about imperialism, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think we are coming up on the time that we can open things up to any
We have a lot of questions
any
here.
participants, any questions or any chat. I'm not sure if Omar has been monitoring.
Yeah, I don't see any questions yet. So, folks, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A.
Well, I've got more while we're waiting. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
in the meantime, while anybody thinks of anything they'd like to ask, I'd love to talk to you about borscht, because you left the Soviet Union as a child, and so obviously borscht has a certain meaning for you that you explore in the book as being sort of challenged by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on February 24th of last year. So I wonder if you could reflect something on that.
Yeah, the epilogue to the book, the last chapter, the closing chapter is on borscht. And I wasn't intending for it to be this way. I was actually going to do one about Thanksgiving in my extremely multicultural neighborhood of Jackson Heights and Queens. So that, that seemed like an appropriate clothing. I mean, what is Thanksgiving? What is American cuisine to all this, people who arrived? And then the war happened. And it just made me rethink everything, because it just brought this whole national identity thing and, defending the national border and defending who you are, in such a sharp relief. And borscht, the beet soup, was something that we grew up with eating as Russians, as did Lithuanians. It was really like a pan-Soviet dish, even though it has its origins in Ukraine. And it's something that my mom makes almost all the time. And I had a big pot of her borscht sitting in my fridge when the war started. And that suddenly, had me wondering, whose dish is it? Because there was a really ugly fight even before this phase of invasion about borscht. Ukrainians tried to defend it as their own, and Russians were goading them and saying, well, no, borscht is a Russian dish. So it was already, a very conflicted dish even before the full-scale invasion, because don't forget the war started in 2014 when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine. And so it leads to this very kind of profound and for me very painful meditation on whose food is it. This is something, a soup that I grew up eating twice a week that we thought was our own. Well, we're, Jewish, Russian, American. And then it became the symbol of Ukraine's resistance and of the conflict. And I end up really kind of trying to decolonize my own thinking. As someone who grew up in Moscow, in the capital of the empire, I sort of looked at borscht from a Russian perspective, maybe. So I kind of decolonized myself by trying to learn Ukrainian, by looking at borscht through, the lens of Ukrainians. The last scene of the book is us inviting Ukrainian friends for all these different borscht that I make. And the Ukrainian friends who I thought would never speak to us again because we're Russian, because we speak Russian. So it was, and I asked, can people come together over food? And again, it's not that simple. I asked Ukrainians in Ukraine, said, do you think Russians and Ukrainians will ever eat borscht together again? And they're like, not until the generations of Ukrainians who win this war and of Russians who lose this war dies, and there's a young, new generation and a new world. They're not going to sit down for a meal. It's a very hopeful trope that eating food brings us together.
Yeah, it's a great an invitation to a meal is a great note to end a book on, and those reflections. And what do you hope that people will take away from the book?
How absolutely fascinating and complex these stories behind our everyday dishes are, and how food is such a perfect lens to look at so many aspects of culture, society, in this case, about national identities and about who we are, about being a more thoughtful eater. Just, the next time you have pizza, there's all these like layers of fascinating cultural history that you can explore through food, and how food is paradoxical. It can bring us together, it can divide us, it can be completely transnational, and it can mean something so fiercely local as well.
Fantastic. Well, Omar, do we have anything else we'd like to raise?
Yeah, it looks like someone has a question. Shelly has a question. She wrote, I have a question about piroshki. Growing up in San Francisco, I would eat at the miniature Russian bakery on Russian Hill. They made tiny, delicious piroshki, and they were always fried. Is there a preference for fried versus baked for this item?
Piroshki, just to introduce this filled pastries. They can have meat or cabbage or potatoes and dough around them. Mostly they're baked, I would say. Fried piroshki is actually something very Soviet. It's like a proletarian thing. But I love fried myself, to be honest. A tiny fried, yeah, no, that. But yeah, they can be either way, either baked or fried.
Excellent. Any more questions? I could tune in with a few things. I have had Belarusian borscht from my brother's girlfriend, who is from that part of the world, or her family is, and it is very good. And I also grew up in Hartford and had very multicultural cafeteria food in school. Every day would be a different sort of cuisine. Even though most of our population here is Black and Puerto Rican, but we would have all sorts of dishes.
Wow.
I grew up with all sorts of things too in the cafeteria food.
No,
but we still had Salisbury steak
it's...
sometimes, and it was,
oh my
I
God.
like that too.
I hardly know what it is even.
My family's from Puerto Rico, so we have a very long lineage of Spanish, African, and indigenous cuisine, as well as American and American colonial cuisine like Spam. Let's see. Any more questions? If not, we could keep going for a little bit longer, or we can close out for this time. How are you all feeling?
I think we can. We had a nice discussion.
Excellent.
Yeah, this has been great. I've loved the chance to talk with you, Anya.
Oh, likewise. Thank you for your wonderful questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to Anya and Andrew. This program is recorded, so please share it with your family and friends, and please go out and buy a national dish. And finally, please join us at the museum for a tour. We're open every day. Check our website for more information on ours, and you can visit our brand new exhibit for business or pleasure, Twain Summer Sojourns, which focuses on the Clemens family's American summer vacations between 1870 and 1910. I'm not sure if it mentions summer foods in the exhibit, but it very well may. So please visit. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for having us.